So how did I start writing? When I came to the United States, I was like in the very beginning, I was very self-conscious about my accent. And then I read this quote that really changed the way I look at my accent. I may speak with an accent, but I don't think with an accent. Think about this. So in 2004, at that point, I already received, at this point I had my master's degree, I received a CFA, and I think I was teaching finance for 3 or 4 years at CU Denver. I was kind of getting bored, not bored, but the challenge of teaching was not there anymore, so I wanted to do something new. And I learned that the street.com was looking for writers. And I was happy to find out that they were paying absolutely nothing. This is a big deal, because if they paid something, then I would not have applied, because I would not feel that I was good enough to write. But since they were not paying anything, actually that was a good thing, because I could not really let them down, at least financially. So I started writing for the street.com, and I absolutely fell in love with writing. So that's how I got into writing. And then I would argue that writing is probably one of the most important things that has happened to me as an individual, like right on the same level as having kids. Why? Well, let me tell you about my writing routine, and then I can explain why. So every day, unless I travel, I get up in the morning about 4:30, 5 o'clock. I get my cup of coffee, I get my headphones, and I write for about 1.5, 2 hours a day. Every single day I write. Now, if you think about what is writing, writing is focused thinking. Just think about what you do when you write. You're sitting there, you look in your computer, and you think. How many of us spend 2 hours a day thinking, doing nothing else but thinking? And that's what writing is. So, but what writing does is basically, think about our mind as two computers. You have like an iPhone computer, which is your conscious mind, and you have your subconscious. Think about it as a huge, like AWS kind of cloud, supercomputer. You have access to your the iPhone computer, which is powerful, which has all your sensors, etc., consciously throughout the day. But to get access to the subconscious requires you sitting down and forcing this connection, this dance between your conscious and subconscious mind. And this is what writing does for me. So a lot of times after I'm done writing, I'm as surprised as what I wrote as the people who are reading it. And I absolutely love doing this. Now, let me ask a question. How many of you work out at least once a week? Okay. How many of you love working out? Okay. All right. So I was talking to a friend of mine. He's like, I don't know how you do this. Like writing every day for 2 hours. I mean, I just don't know how you do this. I said, well, do you work out? He's like, yeah. How often? I said, every day. Do you love working out? He said, absolutely. I can't stand working out. I don't know how you can work out every single day. Now you see what I mean? For me, I think what I did, I learned myself to love writing. And that's why I can do it. And I would argue that everybody in this room should try to see if they can fall in love with writing. Because I promise you one thing, you're going to become just so much better thinker. And I would argue in investing, when I'm confused about something, I write about it. And by the time I finish writing, what it does, it actually helps me to clarify my thoughts. It helps me to find the holes in my thinking that I didn't know I had. So that's what writing is for me. And so your question, how did I become a writer I am today? Think about this. 2 hours a day, almost every day, let's say 300 days a year. That's 600 hours of writing every single year. Multiplied by 20, that's a lot of hours. So how do you get better at doing anything? You just keep doing it. And that's.
Thank you for that. One of the things you talk about, soul in the game, is habits and systems. And you touched briefly upon it just now, but what is the system that you use to make sure that you write every day?
Yeah, sure. So I think to create a system, there are several things you got to do. Number one, you want to tie a trigger point to something. Number one. So in my case, I tie my writing to getting up in the morning. So the first thing, like one of the first things I do after I get up, I start writing. That's number one. Number two, you try to remove as resistance. You try to make it as easy as possible. So what I do when I wake up in the morning, there's my laptop, there are my headphones. I have a writing chair in the bedroom downstairs. If my wife kicks me out of the bedroom in the morning because I bother her, I go to my other writing chair. I try to have as little resistance as possible. I'll give you another system. We live in Colorado and we ski. And the problem with skiing is that you ski for 3 months, 4 months, and then you don't ski for another 9 months, right? So getting into skiing is actually not easy because you just broke the habit. So the way we do this, we have everything packed and ready to go in the morning. So we pack it in the evening, and we have these big IKEA bags where we put our ski boots, everything packed. So in the morning, we remove the friction with kids to go and skiing. Because you have to go skiing, you have to get up probably at 5:30, 6 in the morning. So removing the friction is very, very important. And then you gotta just, to create a habit, you have to keep doing it for a while. I mean, the science behind it says you gotta do it for 20 or 30 days or whatever. But just keep doing it over and over again, and that's how you create a habit. So for me now, some of you who work out seriously will tell me that if you don't work out for a few days, you don't feel good. There's something is missing. I experience that kind of state when I don't write for a little bit. I feel like my thinking is clouded. So it's a kind of, and I think this is something I've done by doing it for so long.
That makes sense. I wanted to explore the application of one of the big topics of soul in the game with you, and that's how stoicism relates to the investment process. Specifically, I think you harp on the dichotomy of control, and you tell a great story in the book about getting your CFA and taking the test and spending the next month and a half in an extreme stressful state waiting for the results of your test, which I think we can all relate to. But you mentioned a couple of times that stoicism would have helped you a lot if you were younger and would have helped you in your investment process, and maybe you can talk a little bit about that.
Yeah. Well, I'm slightly upset at CFA Institute. Let me explain you why. When you and I took our CFAs, which probably late 90s, you took level 1, you had to wait a year. You took level 2, you had to wait a year. Now, you can take it, like every 3 months. So let me tell you the CFA story. And I think that's a good story because everybody can relate to this. You take the exam on June 1st or whatever, and then for 3 months at the time, you had to wait until we get the results. And if you fail at that time, you had to wait another year. And I was so obsessed about passing the exam that I studied a lot more than everybody else. Like I probably studied, 40 hours a week for 4 or 5 months, like a lot more than most other people, but because I felt like I needed to, because I wasn't as smart as other folks were. And anyway, started in late July, I would wait at 10:30 in the morning, waiting for the mailman to come, waiting for the results. Even though we just realized, and that lasted for maybe 3 weeks or a month. And the irony of this was, whenever the results came, I managed not to be at the office at that day. For whatever reason, I was traveling or something. So, but think about how much agony I went through, even though I had zero control over the outcome at that point. So think about this. Let's talk about Stoic philosophy for a second, and then we can apply it to my CFA exams. So Stoic philosophy, it started about 2,000 years ago in Greece and Rome. And philosophy, the word philosophy sounds very intimidating. You usually think about skinny, pale-skinned, white men that tell you a lot of nonsense you can't relate to. Well, philosophy means love of wisdom. That's all it means. And Stoic philosophy, I would argue, it's one of the most practical philosophies out there. Just basically that gives you an operating system for life. That's all it is. And it helps you to get through life, I would argue, to minimize the negativity, to help to deal with negativity that comes from life, and to cope with pain that comes from life a lot. And therefore you would have a more meaningful and happier life. That's all it is. That's all Stoic philosophy is. And it was started by Zeno, who was a merchant, a wealthy merchant. His ship sunk. He barely survived, and he lost all his wealth. So he was trying to figure out how to deal with that. He started Stoic philosophy. And then you have these three characters, three main characters whose writings survive to this day. It's basically Epictetus, who was a slave, Marcus Aurelius, who was a Roman emperor at the time when he basically was the kind of CEO of the whole world. Basically, at the time, Rome basically dominated the whole world. And then you have Seneca, who was kind of the Renaissance man centuries before Renaissance, who was a banker, a philosopher, a playwright, and many other things. One of the most important concepts in Stoic philosophy that could change your life immediately, it changed my life immediately, is the concept of the dichotomy of control. And the concept is very simple, and it's going to sound incredibly simple. Applying it is a lot more difficult. Some things are up to us, some things aren't. That's it. That's the whole concept. It sounds so simple and banal, but let's talk about what is up to us. Up to us are basically our values, how we react to things, what we do, and that's it. Everything else is not up to us. You are driving to this talk and you encounter a red light, everything, and you can get frustrated about this and you're, and angry, etc. But you're getting upset at an inanimate object, literally, the street light. Okay, so it's not up to you. Your stock is going down tomorrow 30%. It's not up to you. Okay, your wife or your spouse or your husband has a bad day and lashes out at you. It's not up to you, but how you react to the spouse, that's what up to you. Let's come back to CFA. What was up to me was what was my process of studying, how much effort I put into studying, how much sleep I got, for the most part, was up to me when I show up to the test. Did I have an extra calculator, which I did? Did I have extra pencils, which I did? But everything else was not up to me. The air conditioner could have been, could have broken down. It was always up to me how I reacted to this. So at the point when I submitted my results, nothing else was up to me. At that point, it's almost like if you're an archer and you shot your arrow out and it's flying. At this point, you have absolutely there is nothing you can do at this point. At that point, after I took the test, I should have said, okay, I've done all I could. When I get the results, I get the results. So Stoic philosophy, and this, this concept of dichotomy of control, is something that there is Asian wisdom, which is whenever we don't know how to attribute to something, we call it Asian wisdom. But knowing and not doing is not knowing. If you read my Stoic philosophy section, or read other better books about Stoic philosophy, and you don't practice this, you don't really, if you're not practice it every day, you're not doing it. You don't know it. So I would argue that practicing this dichotomy of control every single day, if you do this long enough, it's going to become part of your identity. It's become part of you, and that's one of the many concepts from Stoic philosophy that could make your life so much better.
One of the points in the book, and it's a very powerful story that we can all relate to, is your horrible underperformance in a year's period and the pain that you felt from that. What did you learn from that, and how do you apply stoicism to periods like that?
Let me give you a little bit inside baseball. If any of you read my articles, the way they look is like this. There's my father's painting, there's a personal story, there's an investment article, there's my brother's painting, and then there is a section about music. And I love classical music, so I write about classical music. So one day, I sat down to write about this opera by Leoncavallo called Pagliacci. And I started to write about this opera. It was going to be just a music note. I ended up writing about pain. Let me tell you kind of the very brief synopsis of the opera, but it's a very short opera. It's like a 50-minute opera. Whenever it's performed, it's usually performed as another short opera because it's so short. And it's basically circus comes to town, and the circus owner, Canio, has his wife there as well. And then Canio finds out that his wife cheated on him with somebody else. And him and his wife are about to get on stage, and they're going to perform together a scene where his wife is cheating on him. The scene is basically, it's a very famous aria where he's sitting in front of a mirror and he's putting on makeup and basically says, I have to put up on makeup and go on stage and I have to pretend while my heart and laugh while my heart is breaking. Now, how does it relate to investing? Let me explain to you. How many of you have gone through the period of underperformance where you have to face clients, you have to face prospects, and you are kind of bleeding inside. You feel like you're worthless because last 6 months, last year, every decision you made was painful. Like, it turned out to be wrong. In fact, if you just did the George Costanza thing and just did the opposite, you would have been so much better. That was the experience I went through in 2015. Like, every single decision I have made just felt wrong. But by the way, that was not the only time. Like, I had the same feeling in 2012. And in 2012, it was even more painful because I had interns. And like, you know, when you have interns and you get this young mind from university and you have to tell them how great value investing is and it hasn't worked for you for the last 12 months. And so you have this kind of duality because I feel like part of me, like I have this pain inside of me, and I feel like I have to put up this makeup, this kind of duality. I will address how to deal with duality later. But this is basically how this kind of essay about, which I called Pain, Upright Investing came out. I wrote the essay in 2016 and I put it away because it was just, felt like too naked, too exposed to publish it on its own. Then when I was going to include it I was going to put it in the book, I ended up expanding it by a lot. But anyway, that's how it came about. Anyway, so when you go through a period of underperformance, there are certain things you can do to reduce your pain. So let me talk about this. Number one, Stoics come to mind. We talked about internal, the economy of control. The only thing is up to you is your process. How you analyze stocks, just your research basically. How you control your emotions, all these things. That's all that's up to you. Now, the market is going to have an opinion what your companies are worth every single day. You just have to remember this is an opinion. This is not a final judgment, unless your company goes bankrupt or whatever. That's just an opinion. And they have silence of these opinions every single day. Another thing Stoics would advise you, in the ancient Greece, there was this another school of philosophy, they're called sophists. The word sophisticated comes from the word sophist. However, Stoics were not the big fans of sophists because sophists were basically great orators. They could communicate conflicting points. Like they could make one argument, they can turn around and make an opposite argument. But Stoics did not, what they did not like about them, they did not feel like they had a value system figured out. In other words, they had a powerful weapon, but they may not necessarily would aim it in the right direction. Now, what Stoics would say what Marcus Aurelius would say, when you have to deal with pain, don't be a sophist. What it means is this. Words we tell others and we tell ourselves are very powerful. And a lot of times we self-dramatize things, and that self-dramatization actually increases our pain. If you tell yourself, I'm not worthy, everything I buy goes down, my portfolio has been destroyed, all those words are extremely dramatizing things. Now, the way Marcus Aurelius would tell you to do is say, my portfolio of 30 stocks declined 16.2%. 5 stocks declined this much. This stock stays worth this much. This stock is worth this much. And you start talking about the way you would talk to another investor. And not, like if Thomas and I talked about about the portfolio, 2 CFAs talking to each other. That's how we would talk. And then what you find that once you start removing these fancy words, it's actually removes some of the pain. Now, the next thing you can do. And this is what happened to me in 2015. I sat down. So what happened to me in 2015, I was on a trip to Israel. And throughout the year, I think our market was up 5%, our portfolio was down 10 or 15%. And we had a lot of new clients who we didn't have much experience investing with us. So all they saw that they gave us $1 million, now they have $900,000. So they figured, why do I need him? I can lose money. I can lose $100,000 by myself without him. So I was in Israel, and this was kind of the final drop when one of our stocks literally declined, 70% in 2 days. And this was the case where the company that was a $10 stock that I thought it had $2 of earnings power probably had 0 earnings power. That just happened literally in a matter of a few days. The pain I experienced that day in Israel was probably the most, I did not realize that psychological pain could be so physical. I did not realize it could hurt so much. You can experience such a physical pain without actually something crushing your legs or something. I remember I came to a hotel in the evening. So all my friends were partying, etc. And I was just miserable. I came to a hotel and I wrote a letter to clients, basically kind of walking them through exactly what happened. Now, when I was writing the letter, I was not writing as a sophist. I was basically just going through facts. And after I was done with the letter, I felt a lot better. The most interesting part, when clients received the letter, the response we got was actually very positive because I think they appreciated the honesty. The Stoics would also advise you, talk about your portfolio, like in this case, as if you were giving advice to a friend. Imagine not me going through this experience, but a friend of mine was going through this experience. Because suddenly, once you kind of remove yourself from the situation, you become even more logical, okay? You are a lot more logical giving advice to your kids than giving advice to yourself when you were their age. Another thing you can do, probably I should be doing at this moment in time and all the time, is kind of negative visualization, another Stoic concept. You basically, it's kind of vaccinating by basically imagining my portfolio being down 30%, because it will be. I promise you, at some point in time, my portfolio will be down 30%. But if I just visualizing my portfolio being down 30%, I'm almost kind of vaccinating from the pain of the future. Another thing you can do is this situation is to have a circle of trust, friends who are in the same field, who can understand what's happened to you, and talk to them about this. I found it to be at the time very, very useful. So I would argue, we look at pain as negative. I would argue that 2015 experience of that pain I experienced was actually incredibly important for my growth as an investor. Because here's what happens. If you think about it, what investing is, it's a very creative activity. In any creative activity, we are like an instrument that when we are doing well for a long time, it's like our strings get out of tune. And I would argue that, I'll give you an example. Sergei Rachmaninoff, who is a Russian composer, in 1897, he wrote his first symphony. And that symphony was a complete flop. It was compared to 10 Plagues of Egypt by some of the critics. Honest to God. He went into this severe depression, and then he recovered from the depression, and then he wrote his second and third piano concertos, which today considered to be some of the best piano concertos ever written. 10 years later, he wrote his second symphony, which is my favorite symphony. Do you want to go to investing? Ben Graham, the father of value investing. He wrote The Intelligent Investor after he got wiped out during Great Depression. That caused him to re-examine his thinking about it, okay? So the 2015 pain caused me to go back and re-examine our investment process. And I made a very important modification that was specific to me. So the quality today for us is absolute. So if I'm analyzing a company and I don't like the management, I don't like the balance sheet, or something I don't like about the quality, I just move on. When I looked at my mistakes, by the way, remember I was losing money in 2015, but it's not that in 2015 I made all those mistakes. Those mistakes kind of crept in little by little I made them, by stock about in 2012, 2013, 2014. So as I looked at my mistakes, I realized at the time I felt like the market was expensive, and instead of paying up more, I just bought lower quality companies. And the company that basically ended up going bankrupt, went bankrupt because that $2 of earnings power disappeared because it had a horrible balance sheet. So I would argue that pain made me a better investor. Now, there was another book I wrote, two books I wrote, and I would argue the impetus to those books were the pain I experienced in 2011. The Active Value Investing and Little Book of Sideways Markets, they were the impetus of the pain I suffered in 2011. I would argue I'm a huge beneficiary of pain. So my point is this: at the time when you experience this pain, probably it's very difficult to harvest it, but after the pain subsides, actually don't just try to avoid it, embrace it, and try to see what you can learn from it. Try to make sure it makes a better investor out of you. So one thing I did, remember I talked about the duality. One decision I made at the time, I realized that I need to have a kind of a work-free oasis. What does it mean? I will not take any clients who are my friends or who are the people who I interact to all the time. Because can you imagine, like I can imagine going through this period of time where our portfolio is down, etc. And by the way, down 10% is not a big deal. What if it's down 30%? And then I leave work and I can go for drinks with my friends and not think about the portfolio. Now, can you imagine me going for drinks, for beers with my friends, and I manage their money? I go from one hell to another. Okay, so since that point, I made a decision that I will never manage money for any of my friends. That has been a very, very important decision. So that's basically, I would argue, if you read this chapter in the book, it's going to be so much better than hearing it from me. But this is the answer to your question.
No, that's very helpful. I know we've all experienced it, and I wanted to get your insights into it because I thought those were just really applicable to getting over the hump. I wanted to open it up for questions. Anybody have a question, comment?
When you go through your daily writing process, is it like structured where you're writing based on a article or a book that you're working on, or is it more unstructured where it's kind of journaling your personal experience, or a little bit of both?
That is such a great question. So I'm going to be hypocritical for a second, because I would argue that everybody should try to write a journal. 5 minutes a day, 30 minutes a day. And the reason I'm hypocritical, because I don't, okay? But let me explain why. Because I tried to do this, but I was just confused. My mind is confused, because when I sit down to write a journal, my mind is confused. Am I writing an article or am I writing a journal? So this is like I stopped doing it because I just write 2 hours a day anyway. But I would argue, if you're not me and if you don't write essays all the time or whatever, at least journal. That's number one. Number two, there are two types of writers, okay? There are like what called professional writers. Like John Grisham, I think he writes 1,500 words a day. So like a lot of writers set a number of words a day every single day. I don't do that because I create a space for me to write. It's a physical and temporal space. What I mean by this, I have a chair in my bedroom. That's my physical space. I created time at 5 a.m. That's my time, space. And that's when I write. Like for me, like I have the headphones waiting for me, put them on, and listen to classical music. I have my soundtracks, whatever. During that time, I do nothing else. I don't answer emails. I don't do Slack. I turn everything off. Let me tell you a story. This is an interesting story. I have a friend who is a CFA in Boston. Him and I had this conversation literally a month ago. And he says, Vitaliy, I write quarterly letter like everybody else does in this room, but I wanna write an article a week. I said, to write an article a week, you have to write every day. He says, but you know what? I don't know if I have 52 articles to write. I said, you know what? You're absolutely right and you're absolutely wrong. I probably write about maybe 40, 50 articles a year, something like this. But if you ask me on January 1st, what are the 50 articles are gonna be? I have no idea. Now, this is what happens. If you write every single day, your brain will go from being like 5% writer and 95% investor to maybe become like 20% writer and 80% investor. So you're gonna have what I call a writer's brain. Once you develop the writer's brain, what happens to you, you start noticing things that you haven't noticed before. You start looking for ideas. And suddenly, you start seeing analogies and mental models that you haven't seen before, that otherwise you would not have noticed. So it's gonna make you, it's gonna modify you. You're gonna be a different person. And then what I do when I notice it, I write it down. I just have a list of things that I thought, oh, this is kind of interesting. I wanna explore this more. And so when I sit down to write, a lot of times, something I want to think through, and I have a list of those things. And by the way, a lot of times what happens, I'm stuck, and what I do is just put it away. Now, coming back to my writing process, this is very, very important. The reason I create this space to write, don't create a word count, because I have no idea how many words I'm going to write this day. And this is very important. Many times, I'm sitting in front of a computer for 2 hours and have nothing to show. However, in the beginning, I used to get angry at myself, like I failed at this. Over time, I learned to forgive myself, because here's what happens. When you sit at the computer for 2 hours, you planted seeds in your subconscious. When you're going for a walk in the park, when you're taking a shower, your subconscious is still working. This AWS computer is still working. And I cannot tell you how many times I have this idea, this is how I'm gonna say. I didn't even, by the way, the irony of this, I didn't even know I was thinking about it when this thought came to mind, okay? So that's basically kind of what my writing process is. Oh, and then one more thing, this conversation with my friend, and he said, Vitaliy, I'm only gonna write about investing. You write about philosophy, classical music, parenting, whatever. I'm only going to write about investing. I said, you know what, you say this today, but when you have a writer's brain, it kind of has a mind of its own, and you have no idea where it's going to take you. So anyway.
Continuing on that theme, when you have a work in progress, do you set it as a goal to be as concise and as clear as possible to your audience in possibly rewriting what you have come up with as a concept in your process? Because I find I do that a lot. I don't send out something right away, but I look at how I can make it more concise, more clear, because sometimes my verbiage is too extensive or whatever. if you could comment on that.
Absolutely. That is such a great question. I would argue most of the writing is rewriting, and that's what you're referring to. I look at my first drafts, and they're kind of embarrassing. But all I'm trying to do is trying to get the words out of my mind, and then as I go through them, this is where actually a lot of thinking is happening, is because I'm rewriting it, new ideas come up, suddenly new analogy creeps in, and you're like, oh, I can expand on this. So I spend probably most of my time in a rewriting mode, not in a writing mode, I would argue. And that's how, I just wrote an article about unions, just came out a couple of days ago. And let me tell you how I wrote this article. By the way, when I write, and I've been doing this forever, I have an editor. And it helps me just basically, when I write, I can get it to 80%, and he can help me to get it to 90, 95, and then I do the last 5%. And so I would send it to him, and what I found when I was writing about unions, I was very passionate about this. I mean, when you're passionate about something, you become extremely one-sided. When you become one-sided, people who read it actually start respecting you less because they can see the biases. So my first drafts were extremely kind of one-sided, and he would give me pushbacks on these points. So I went back and actually rewrote a lot to make it's not even more balanced, more logical. So when you read it, you can see that this is a person who is trying to use logic, not just emotions. So also a lot of times what I do, when I write something, I send it to a few friends to get their feedback. And a lot of times that feedback becomes very useful. And like the union, like this article I wrote about unions, there's a section at the bottom where I talk about, like one of the common pushbacks against unions is that CEO pay is so much greater than the average worker's pay. So one of my friends told me about, that was a pushback to that. So I ended up actually writing an additional section just to address that point. Having somebody you trust to provide you feedback is, also very, very beneficial.
So growing up in a different country and then moving to the U.S., how has that influenced your writing style and your investment philosophy with the different cultures?
Yeah, it's interesting. I think there's a lot more sarcasm in my writing. Also, I make fun of the language a little bit. Victor Borge had this saying, "This is your language, I'm just trying to use it," when he was making fun of the English language. I would argue probably, being an immigrant to this country, I probably appreciate a lot more than people who were born into it, just because of the contrast. You appreciate ice a lot more when especially in Richmond, when you just came from a 95% heat, right? So it's kind of, I appreciate what this, the freedoms of this country and the freedom of speech, etc., and I value it a lot more because I haven't experienced it I experienced the opposite in Russia, in Soviet Russia. I think that's probably the biggest kind of, when I write about this country, that's probably the perspective that's the most different. That's the most different, just because as an immigrant you appreciate it. You appreciate these things more. Am I answering the full question, or was there something else?
Well, in your investment philosophy.
Oh, in my investment philosophy, it made me avoid Russia and China. No. I would argue that's probably, it made me a little more cynical when I look at companies at times. But that's basically it, really. Yeah.
As a younger guy, I'm looking at you, and it seems like there's no more worlds to conquer. So I guess my question is, what's next for you?
Oh, I'm trying to become a better investor. My original title for this book was going to be Student of Life. And a student of life, it's probably one of the most, if you read this book, you see this concept flowing through the pages quite often. And a student of life is an attitude that it's impossible to teach something to a person who thinks he already knows the answer. Okay? So if you have this attitude that I'm a student of life, that I'm constantly learning, that I'm a student, I'm just, then life becomes very different. I feel like I can learn so much more about investing. I feel like I can improve so much more. I feel like there's so much more knowledge out there. And by the way, the more this is, I think, Einstein, but the more you learn, the more you realize that how little you know. There was something about circumference on your. So part of the reasons why I love writing is because I get to learn. Like, it motivates me to learn more. There's so many benefits of writing. I could say I'm gonna have my kids listen to this talk because I'm trying to get in their head how important writing is. So if you're especially your age, write. Yes, I'm looking forward to keep learning. And that's so there's plenty for me to conquer.
That's a great place to end the luncheon, and a very important lesson for everybody. Keep learning. Vitaliy, thank you so much. Please,
Oh, thank you.
and thank you again for coming to Richmond.